Good night. Thank you. We're going to begin with a selection from yesterday's daf Nun Hey in the Mishnah. And I'm going to connect it or attempt to connect it somehow to today's daf of a part of the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. Okay, so we'll see if we can do that. So yesterday's Mishnah talked about another one of the many takanos that we've been learning over the last month or so. This is known as takanos meirish. Okay, takanos meirish is mentioned in the Mishnah. I'm on Nun Hey Amud Aleph 55a, about halfway through the Mishnah. The Mishnah talks about the following situation: the al hamerish hagazol shabanu babira sheyitol es damov. So the Mishnah says one of the 4 or 5 testimonies that Rav Yochanan ben Gudgada testified was about a halacha regarding a stolen object. The halacha is that if you steal something, and we'll see this a little inside also, if you steal something, the letter of the law, right? The letter of the law is that you have to return it, A, and B, you have to return that item. There is one exception, however, that the Chachamim imposed, and that's called a meirish. If you were to steal a beam and you actually built it in your house. So the Chachamim said, we're going to be easy on the guy, because chances are the guy wants to do tshuva, and being how important tshuva is, we don't want to give him any reason not to do tshuva. So therefore, we're going to decide that the best way for him is to go and pay the value rather than knock down his whole house, because 99 out of 100 people will not start disassembling their house if they happen to steal lumber and use it as their subfloor. Right? It's just not going to happen. It's not practical. So therefore, the Chachamim put on their practicality hat, right? Usually we get knocked a lot, how we're impractical, we have these crazy laws, right? Once in a while, we have something that is, that's for the betterment of society, to protect people, to not have to give them an excuse why they can't do tshuva. So this is what is known as the meirish. It's called takanas ha-meirish. Okay? And this is what the Mishnah says. And if you actually look in the Gemara about halfway, the Gemara doesn't talk about this at length. It just says one thing. It just says that the Mishnah quoted the opinion of Beis Hillel. However, we're about 10 or 12 lines from the bottom. The Gemara says, Beis Shammai omri mekakeya kol habira kulo umachzir meirish labala. Beis Shammai. Now you have to understand a little bit about this machlokas. Beis Shammai is what we call, let's call them sticklers to the law, right? Shammai was not a positive, happy person, right? If you remember the various stories about him in Masechet Shabbos and elsewhere, he was letter of the law, right? He wasn't any fun, right? He wasn't, right? He just said, this is the law. I'm not very flexible, right? In Shammai's world, if you wanted to do tshuva on returning a stolen object, then you had to take that object no matter where it was, right? We have this other concept of paying someone back. The Mishnah at the end of Bava Kama discusses how far you have to go to pay someone back who you stole, right? Maybe we'll get to that at the end or at some point. So that's also important to realize, that you have to return things, you have to follow the law. But when it's such an extreme case of knocking down a house to return some lumber, that's a little overboard. Beis Shammai says it ain't overboard. In fact, that's what you have to do. You have to knock down the whole house. Okay, obviously we don't hold like Beis Shammai. So we see a clear example. How the Mishnah, first of all, holds like Beis Hillel. And it's another one of the dozens of takanos that we have in the 5th perek of Maseches Gittin. Now, there's actually a related Gemara on this subject, It happens to come from an obscure reference. It happens to come from Maseches Tainus, right? The Gemara actually over here quotes, and Gittin quotes two or other three sources, one in Bava Kama, one in Tainus. Now, the reason why this is discussed in Maseches Tainus, which is not a likely Masechta that you would think that would discuss the laws of Geneva and Gezela, is because the Gemara in the second parak of Tainus, if you remember, we had this about a year and a half ago, was discussing a situation where there were fast days. And unlike today, where we just go to shul, we fast, we try to pass the time by watching Netflix, and we just pray that we survive. They actually were very active on their fast days. They went out to the street. They had certain processions that the Gemara that the Mishnah discusses, and they would take ashes and they would bring out the teva to the street, and they would cry out and they would say speeches and divrei kavushin and all kinds of things to get people motivated. And one of the motivating speeches that was given, the Mishnah says it was given by a chacham or a zaken. He said the following: Achenu lo sak v'tainis garmin ela tshuva maisim tovim garmin. He says the truth is that all of this fasting is worthless. What's key is the actions. You could fast all you want and still be bad, right? Fasting, especially today, intermittent fasting is right, certainly a flavor of the month. You don't necessarily have to be religious to fast, right? Fasting, you could do it for your own self. What's important and the essence of a fast day is tshuva and maisim tovim. And this person who would speak in the streets would say the following: Sheken matzino ba'anshe ninveh, because if you look in the pasuk by anshe ninveh, shelo namar behen vayar Elokim es sakam es tanisam, ela vayar Elokim es maaseim kishovim midarkum hara'ah. If you remember, when Yonah comes back or goes back for a second time after his first attempt, right, doesn't end well, Yonah tries again. And he says, you know what God wants from you? It doesn't say in the pasuk that God saw that they were fasting and they were walking around with shmatas. And no. They didn't portray themselves as that. They were interested in cleaning up their deeds, and they did real tshuva, right? That's what was important. That's what the pasuk hones in on. And the Gemara, a few lines down, actually says, when the pasuk in Yonah says, "Vayashuvu ish midarko hara'ah min achamos asher b'kapehem," that's a pasuk from the third parak of Yonah, that they returned. Right, we say this every year in Yom Kippur. Right, if we're still up for Haftorah of Mincha. Right, it says that they did tshuva from the chamas that were in their hands. So what does that mean? What kind of tshuva could you do for chamas asher b'kapehem? So the Gemara wants to know, what does that mean? Shmuel says, you know how far the Anshe, now remember, Anshe Ninveh weren't Jews, right? The whole irony of Yonah was that he was preaching to non-Jews, okay? Which, again, is a separate discussion on Yonah, not for now, but keep that in mind, because Yonah is begging these people to do tshuva, and what are they doing? How did they do tshuva? So Shmuel says, "Afilu gezel meirish ubana babir mekakea kol abira kula umachzer meirish lebalav." You know what they did in the times of? You know what they did in Nineveh? They held like Beis Shammai. They didn't hold like Bezalel. They said, in order to do tshuva from everything we stole, we're even going to go beyond the letter of the law, and to do tshuva properly, we're gonna, for the lumber that we stole, we're going to knock it down from our house, and we're going to return it. So you see, a little ironic how these people, in their attempt to do tshuva, went way, way beyond. So that was, that was pretty fascinating. There's a comment. Let me just open it up. There's a comment of the Ben Yehoyada on this pasuk, umina chamas asher b'kapehem. So it's interesting, the word chamas, right? What is chamas? Well, depends how you say it, Hamas or Hamas, right? So he says that The Ben Yoyada says, the imgazol mer shibana v'hu noten dam avadai nikra chamas. He says the truth is because if you steal a beam and you build it and you return only the money or the value of the lumber, right? That's called, yes, on the one hand, you're doing tshuva, but that's called chamas. Why is it called chamas? Aren't you returning money at least to satisfy v'heshev esagzela? So we say no, because the Gemara, he quotes the Gemara in Bava Kama at the end of the 6th parak that says, you know what the difference between a gazlan and a chamsan is? A gazlan robs you and doesn't pay you. A chamsan is what we call in English to extort. When you extort, when you force somebody to sell you something that he doesn't want to, you throw money at him and you take it, that's not as bad as a gazlan, but still you are a chamsan. And a chamsan at least pays money. So what is this person doing? V'imken nimtza ha'avon yatsa misug gezel, says the Ben Yehoyada. So it's not gezel anymore, but v'nirsham bekapam, but it's still left in their hand besug chamas. The beams built in their house are still called chamas. That's why in Nineveh, the non-Jews went overboard in doing tshuva to take even the chamas, right? The object that they could have paid the value back to the owners, they decided to knock down their house and return the lumber that they stole, just to get that term of chamas off of them. So we see, at least a little bit now, that this concept of returning something exactly the way you stole it, right, so that you don't end up being called a chamsan, right, is the primary way of returning. So the question is, why is that? So in order to understand the answer to that, let's dive into this topic of what they call the Heshiv Esagzela. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit on the pasuk. If I were to ask you where this concept of returning something that you stole from, most people would say Mishpatim, Kedoshim, right? One of those parshas that talk about, right, the laws of stealing. So the truth is that the pasuk of Veheshev Hasagzela is actually written in Parshas Vayikra. All the way at the end of Parshas Vayikra, it talks about one of the ashamos that we bring. And one of the ashamos that we bring is called an asham gezela. An asham gezela is a carbon asham that we bring when we steal something and we deny it and we take a shvua and then we end up getting busted. So not only did you steal something, but you lied about it. So now you have three penalties. You have to return the object. You have to pay a fifth, 20%, which the Gemara in Bava Metzia actually says it's 25%, but not for now. And the third thing is you have to bring a korban asham. The pasuk says, I am in the end of Vayikra 6:23, pasuk Chaf Gimel. It says, "V'haya ki yechata v'yashem v'heshev esagzel asher gazal." Okay, the end of the pasuk isn't important for now, but it's basically whatever you took, whatever was deposited by you, whatever you found, you have to return it. But the pasuk starts off by saying, "V'heshev esagzel asher gazal." Okay, so we usually, not usually, but once every so often, we quote a Kli Yakar, because he's very near and dear to me, and commentators. He always brings something special to the table. And here says the Kli Yakar. Kli Yakar says a beautiful thought on this concept. Again, the pasuk starts off by saying, when he realizes, again, v'haya ki yechata, when he realizes that he had sinned, okay, v'yashem, and he's guilty, then he has to return the object. So the Kli Yakar says, Perish Rashi, Kishayakir ba'atzmo lashuv b'tshuva. What does that mean? He called chotel la'olam lo yasim asham nafsho. He says something extremely practical, and everybody, me included, so I could speak for myself, I could probably speak for everyone, because this is just the way human nature is, and you can't argue with it. And if anybody denies this, I won't believe them. He called chotel olam lo yasim asham nafsho, right? Nobody ever considers themselves guilty because the derech ish yashar be'enav. We all think that we always do the right thing, even if we're not. Tihu mora la'atzmo heter b'kol derachav. Because we're always what they call mora heter, right? We just had this concept 4 or 5 days ago in Gittin. Remember the apotropos? The apotropos who does business with all the yisomim and the money, and he's their trader, and he's their money manager, and he manages their checkbook and does all the deposits. At the end, he has to swear that he didn't take anything that he shouldn't have. The Gemara wants to know why, because when you're a custodian, every single cent you have to be honest about, because people tend to say, oh, I didn't get this right, I didn't get that right, he owes me here. Everybody has these internal cheshbonos, right? And if you take $100, you're like, yeah, that was my expense that I used for something last week. And you may or may not be right. So therefore, they made the apotropos take a shvur. Here he says the same thing. He says, when you do something, even if it's, with good intentions, and you take something, he says, everybody says that I'm doing the right thing. He says, you know what? I'm taking $150 from this guy today because 3 years ago when I invited him for lunch, he finished a whole bottle of wine that he shouldn't have. And that wine cost me $150. So this guy for 3 years said, okay, I'm going to get him back, right? Everybody has these internal calculations of how much everybody owes you, right? We all do this in some way, shape, or form. Now, and when he takes the money back, it may not be legal, but in his mind, in his or her mind, there's many justifications for taking money from people. So that's exactly what the Kli Yakar says over here. Oh, nidmelo ki asalo eza avel. Or a guy came and he damaged my property. I invited him to go swimming, and he smashed one of my stones, whatever it is. And he owes me money, and I'm going to wait and get that money back from him one day, right? Therefore, one day comes 2 years later, huma'akav pigdono. He says, okay, let me watch something, and then he denies ever taking it. Lefichach biyom shiyasim asham benafsho v'yakir ta'uso v'chilo tova seba'ama v'zeh shamar v'ashem. That's why the pasuk says when he realizes that he is guilty, the point is that he has to be asham. Asham means guilty when he realizes his mistake, that he wronged this person, and now he realizes that he's guilty. Then, and only then, he will set his heart and he will do full tshuva, and then he has to return the stolen object. And he says, Lo yisha yishalem demei hagzela. No. You can't steal something. You can't steal, right, a bar of gold and then return $1,900 for it, or whatever gold goes for these days. You have to return the actual object. And that's what he says, right? You have to return the actual object itself. Okay, so that's the Kli Yakar. We see that there's something about returning the actual object. So the question is, what is so special? Why does the Torah, and the Gemara in Bava Kama goes into it a lot, and we'll see in the Sefer HaChinuch, he quotes the Gemara in Bava Kama, but the Rambam actually brings down this law in Hilchas Tshuva. Hilchas Tshuva, at the end of the second chapter of Hilchas Tshuva, the Rambam talks about the differences of sins ben adam l'makom and ben adam l'chavero. Right, this is the famous Rambam everybody knows about how you have to ask 3 times, and so on and so forth. The Rambam says very succinctly. He says, "Ein hatshuva v'lo yom kippurim achaprin, ella alaveros shebein adam l'makom." Tshuva, right, helps. Tshuva plus Yom Kippur helps regarding averos between man and God. If you ate something not kosher, if you had an inappropriate relationship, that's between you and God, and that's where tshuva and Yom Kippur come into play. However, avero shebein adam lechavero could go nachovelas chavero, if I knock my friend out, o mekal chavero, o goes low, or if I steal from him, here are the key words. Eino nimcha lo le'olam ad sheyiten lechaveru mashu chayav lo v'yiritzehu. Okay, you have to pay him exactly what it is you took from him. If you stole money from him, you return the money. If you stole an object, you have to return the money. And then, even after you return exactly what you stole, you still have to ask for him mechila. So the Rambam says specifically in Hilchos Tshuva that it's not only returning it, it's returning the exact object. Now, the chinuch says something very interesting because it actually brings down our halacha that we have in the Mishnah. If we look in the chinuch, mitzvah number 130, mitzvahs hashavas gezel, shenitztavinu lahashivas agzela, klomar she'im hadavar mamish agazel hu etzlo, if what I stole is still with me, v'lo nishtana b'rashuso, and it did not change, it's in its same form, shechayiv lahashivo, el hanigzal, you have to return it back to the one who you stole it, kamo shehu, exactly the way it is. Again, right off the bat, he's stressing you got to return exactly what you stole, and not to acquire it and pay him back the value in cash. Okay, then he goes into, the din about Yish. We're not going to talk about Yish and Shinoi. That's for Bava Kama. Hopefully, we'll get to it in about a year and a half from now. Actually, not a year and a half. Maybe about a year, maybe less. Let's read what he says. That's
in December. We start Bava Kama in December.
Oh, okay, December, right? But this is in the middle. This is in the 60s, in the 7th parak. So in March, the Ides of March. Okay, so first of all, what's the reason? What's the reason why you have to return an object? So the chinuch has 3 words. Usually he says shoresh hamitzvah, and he goes into the reason. He has 1 word, shoresh hamitzvah yadua. That's all he says. He says, it's such a no-brainer, I'm not even going to waste ink telling you why it's important to return what you stole. Okay, obviously it has to do with tshuva, and so on and so forth. Now, look what he says. If you skip down toward the end, he discusses the various laws about Yush and things that we're not going to talk about, but what's nogeya us is, he says, Abel Chachamim tiknu mipnei takanas hashavim shekol ma shehishbicha biyad hagazlan achar Yush habaylim yeh shalo. Okay, he says that if you stole something and now it's worth more, right? And then the owner had Yush, I get to keep it. And then he says a couple lines later, he says the davar, he says he gets to keep it, and he calls and he brings down a Gemara about Takanas Hashavim. He says the davar zeh yesh koach biyad chachamim lasoso. The question is, and that's what after a half hour of listening to this, you may ask yourself and say, hold on a second, why all of a sudden are we so nice? Meaning, we have a Shulchan Aruch, we have laws. I understand a person wants to do tshuva, but I don't really know too many cases where we bend the rules, so to speak, and allow for someone who may not be so religious to say, okay, you know what, we don't want to turn him off, because if we tell him he's going to knock his house, that he's going to have to knock his whole house down, right, to return the lumber that he stole, he's not going to do it. Well, we don't see that by anything else.
But so I don't even understand why this is called Takanas Hashavim. He's not doing tshuva. The Bezdin comes and says, you owe the money.
Tshuva. Right, okay.
Yeah, he's not doing tshuva. We could say this is not his option.
Okay.
What do you say to that?
If there's time at the end, we'll talk about it, but there's never time at the end.
I know that trick.
Okay. So anyway, so let's finish this, because this is a very, very important line he's about to say. Again, the question was, right? A person's becoming religious, or he's just Jewish now. Do we say, you know what? You have to daven 3 times a day. It's a real pain because you start working early. You know what? For the first 6 months of you becoming Jewish, you only have to daven once. You could pick Shachris, Mincha, or Mariv. Do we have this concept where we make it easier for the person? No, we don't see this concept ever. So the question is, why over here do we bend the rules and say, okay, we'll have Rahmanas on him? So what's important to
Here
remember
too,
here is,
Bezalel.
well,
There
you're on
is
a
a
roll.
tshuva of Moshe that he says that you could be lenient and allow people who are doing Balei Tshuva
Correct.
to use China.
Correct. But
Rabbi
throughout the
Tendler told me.
yes,
Rabbi Tendler told me that was because of Takanas Hashem.
because the kind of okay, but in the Talmud, you rarely see this concept on, with regarding other things. The point over here is this is Dine Mamonus. So keep that in mind. So because it's Dine Mamonus, you see where we're going with this. The Sefer HaChinuch says, "V'davar zeh yesh koach biyad chachamim la'asoto." Because it's monetary related, the chachamim could step in. Lefi shekol davar shebemamon hem yecholim la'asot bo kecheftzam. The chachamim could do whatever they want when it comes to monetary items. And here's the key word: va'afilu keneged tzivoy haTorah. Even if it's contrary to what the Torah says. Why? Now we should remember this because we did this 2 weeks ago in the daf, right? Kumoshe yadua shehefker bezin hefker. Remember Prusbul? The Torah says when it comes to Shemitah, that's it. All bets are off. All loans are canceled. Comes Hillel and says, no. The Torah, forget what the Torah says. I'm going to improve society because no one's going to lend money anymore, right? We're going to have a big problem because everyone's going to borrow money. They're going to wait a few years. They're going to come Shemitah, and that's it. They're going to say, I don't know your money. So Hillel said, we can't function like that, right? There will never be, there will never be any more lending. So that's what Hillel did. So that's exactly what the Chinuch is saying over here. He says, Shehefker bezin hefker, and so on and so forth. So we at least are able to understand what power the Chachamim had when it comes to a Hakanas Meirish. And the truth is, this is actually a halacha. This is not just a nice thing that we employ. We say that if you look in we say that this is in fact true. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat 360 says, Kol hagozel chayv lahachzir hagzela atzma. You have to return the actual object that you stole. Shenemar v'heshev es hagzela shagazal. V'im avda o nishtanis. So if you lose it or if you change it, mishalom dameha, then you have to pay the value, so on and so forth. Afilu gazel kor ubana b'bira gedola. If I steal a beam and I build it in my house, hoav lo nishtanis, since it's in its same condition, nothing happened to it. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Din Torah, the truth is, Mida Oraisa, you have to knock down Shayaharas Kol Abinyan, V'yachzer HaKor L'Bayal, Ma'aval Tiknu Chachamim B'nei Takanas HaShavim, says the Shulchan Aruch, Shia Nosen as Dameha, V'lo Yafzer HaBinyan, period. So that's great. So far, it's everything that we have seen. He adds something very interesting, something that we didn't think about. How about, he says on Sukkos, what if I steal a 2x4, right? You put a 2x4 on top, right, to hold down the sukkah, right? People, they use it on top of the sukkah between the poles and the schach, right? You need about 4 or 5 2x4s. Let's say you steal them and you use it for your sukkah. Okay, so, and then you want to do tshuva. Afilu gazel kore va'asa besukos hachag ubal balakore v'tova b'toch hachag. Let's say the guy caught you and goes over to your house and he sees that it's your and he sees that there were 2x4s that were stolen, and now the guy wants his lumber back. Nosen lo es dameha. So it's the same law. You don't have to knock down your sukkah. Okay, so it applies to a house and it applies to sukkah. However, aval acher hachag, what if it is after the holiday? Okay, what if it's after the holiday? So the Shulchan Aruch says, now he's quoting, we don't have time to look at it, but this is actually a Gemara in Sukkah Daf Lamed Aleph. If you know Perek Lulav HaGazel, so everyone talks about stealing a lulav, mitzvah ba'avera, if I steal aravos, but what's lesser discussed is stealing a sukkah. not very common, right? You would figure that that's pretty, ultimate chutzpah, right? But nevertheless, it's actually discussed in the Perek Lulav Hagazel and Sukkos, Daf Lamed Aleph. So the Shulchan Aruch says that if it's after Sukkos, what do? Ho v'lo nishtanes, v'lo bana, since it hasn't changed and it's not in cement, machzer es hakora atzma. Then we don't apply the law anymore. You could actually return the beam. Okay, there's a great question I saw. Rav Elchanan Wasserman asked a question and says, hold on a second. If you have to return it after Sukkos, that basically means that, right, you're allowed to benefit with a stolen beam in your sukkah. Why isn't it mitzvah haba ba'avera? Because if they make you return it after Sukkos, that means that you were allowed to keep the beam during Sukkos. But what's the difference between that and stealing the lulav? Okay, he has a very lumdish answer about the way to understand mitzvah haba ba'avera. We're not going to talk about it now, but it's an interesting answer. Now, so that's the end of the Shulchan Aruch. So we see that this is actually a law. Great. Here's where the Ramah comes in. The Ramah comes in and says, we're talking about stealing something movable, like lumber. He says, Haggad, says the Ramah, Gezel Karka. What if I steal land? Uban aleha binyanim gedolim. And I start building townhouses, a whole development. I built on stolen land. 5 years later, after I get the last C of O on the house, the owner comes back and says, this is my land. And he proves it. So what's the halacha? So you would think, come on, right? This has to be a takanas merish. This is, right? What do you expect, the guy to knock down all the homes and give him back the land? Says the Ramah, absolutely. Sarach lister hakol, you have to knock down every single house or co-op or apartment building that you bought on that you built on the land. Ulahashav karka lebailim, the lo asu takanas hashavim bekarka. Because everything we've been saying for the last half hour does not apply to land. It only applies to beams, something that's movable. So that's a real chiddush. Now, before we even talk about the reason, you may be wondering, hold on a second. What are you doing over here? You're stealing someone's land and you're building, and you decide to build a development on it. So how about asking yourself a question such as, can I even steal land? Right? That's a pretty good question. How in the world do I steal land? I could understand stealing lumber. I could go into a lumber yard and steal lumber, but how do I steal land? So there's a big topic about in Bava Kama and the Sefer Sukkah. And if I do steal land, what happens to something that I built on it, right? So if you think that this is such a crazy idea, I point you to last week. Ready for this? July 7th, an article in Newsweek. Indigenous chief wants to take back Ben & Jerry's headquarters built on stolen land. Now, Ben & Jerry's has been in the news for bad stuff, right, over the last couple of years. So here's another one, right? And anybody who has any ties to Vermont who's listening over here would know that their headquarters are in Burlington, Vermont, an indigenous tribe descended from the Native American nation that originally controlled the land in Vermont that Ben & Jerry's headquarters is located on, would be interested in taking it back after the company publicly called for stolen lands to be returned. Look at that. Ben & Jerry's says, we don't want to talk about ice cream, right? We want to get into politics as usual. Don Stevens, chief of the Nulhegan band of the Kusuk Abenaki Nation. Okay, one of the 4 descended from the Abenaki that are recognized in Vermont, told Newsweek, it was always interested in reclaiming the stewardship of our lands. It comes after the ice cream company was questioned as to when it would give up its Burlington, Vermont headquarters, which sits on a vast swath of U.S. territory that was under the auspices of the Abenaki people before colonization. The U.S. was founded on stolen indigenous land, the company said in a statement ahead of Independence Day. This year, let's commit to returning it. Okay, we have this. I don't know if anyone's following Mount Rushmore has a similar problem now also. Mount Rushmore doesn't belong to us, but at least we see that this is not a halachic problem from 1500 years ago. This is actually today. So now back to our more important topic, forget Ben and Jerry's, of why in the world would the Ramah say that real estate is an exception? So there are several opinions offered. The first one is the opinion of the Sma. Okay, the Sefer Me'iris Einayim says, you know why there's no takana when it comes to land? The kivan dehu davar kavua va'omed, because it's not going anywhere. Everybody knows who the landowner is. You see a building going up in Central Park and you decide to buy a condo in the park. You're going to tell me that you thought that someone actually owned the land in the middle of Central Park? Or pick whatever it is, right? Pick your example. Of course not. So therefore, the Sma says, anybody with a half a brain should realize that, you know, you're buying a house on land that was stolen. There's a good chance that you're going to have to return it back. So that's one interesting opinion of the Sma. The Taz, by the way, does not agree. He says, Divrei Hasma ein lahem biur. He doesn't like that at all. V'nira hatam de'akarka eino nigzeles. He says, you know why? Because if you really learn the sugyas in Masechah Sukkah, you know that karka can never be stolen. So what does that mean practically? What if you do steal it? How can you tell me it can't be stolen when Ben and Jerry stole the land? So the answer is, because it means that it can't get stolen, meaning that if the owner comes back, he could always reclaim it back. It's never yish. If I lose my wallet on the train, then there's a 99.9% chance I'll never see it again. But if someone kicks me off the land, right, I'm never going to have yish. I'm never going to give up hope because the guy can't put it in his pocket and run away to Switzerland. Right? It's there. It ain't moving. So therefore, you never, ever lose up hope when it comes to real estate. You always could get your land back, right? As opposed to Masha Enkein Bekoros. What about the beam in your house? Maybe after a few years, it could get moldy and it could get rotten. Or it could burn down. And then it could never be returnable. That's when it comes to lumber. When it comes to real estate, it could always be returnable. All right. Here's a Pischei Tshuva that is going to make your day. Okay, especially for a rabbi in Washington who had many problems building his yeshiva. Says the Pischei Tshuva. I wonder if you ever heard of this. He says, Ayin Masha Amar Alashon Hasma v'Ayin B'Levush. So the Pischei Tshuva brings down the Levush about why land is different. Shekasov tam acher, dilakach lo asu takanas hashavim b'karka, the time of my asu takanas hashavim, kedei shelo yalim agazlan, shegazal, v'lo yaset tshuva. Because when it comes to the takanas hashavim, stealing the lumber, right? We don't want them to forget, right? Or should I say, cover it up, and not to do tshuva. U'b'karka lo shayach zeh. You can't cover up land. A beam you could steal, cover it up, and once you sheetrock, in 100 years, no one will ever know about it. But this reason doesn't apply to land. Okay, so that's his reason. Then he brings down the Ayin B'Tshuvas Hamabit Chelek Gimel Shekasav Di'im Lo Naaseh B'Hasagas Gvul Midaito. Okay, Shehabanaim. Here's a question: you hire the contractor. You're building a yeshiva in Washington. You hire the contractor, he starts building, and some of the building and some of the house is actually on the other neighbor's property. You went over by 2 feet into the next guy's land without knowing. Again, it was an honest mistake. Efshar shagam hagaonim yodu she'asu b'takanas hashavim. So you want to know a practical takanas hashavim? This is a case where you go into someone else's land, right? Your porch, or your basement, or your foundation, or something that can't really be taken down, goes into your neighbor's yard. So what do? You don't take a chainsaw and cut it off, right? You have to v'yipara lebal hakarka ma sheshava hachatzi ama. Whatever 2 square feet of land is worth, that's what you have to pay. Hilo hichmiru ela b'bnei ma she'avar alo tasig gvul reyecha. The only reason you would be machmir is if you were over on lo tasig gvul reyecha v'hachi lo avar kivin shelo yada. Here, you didn't really know. So, it's we'll have Rahmanas on you. But what's interesting is that, just like you mentioned before, so there are exceptions in today's society. Here's another perfect application of this rule that could go into effect, and we don't make the person actually chop off. Now, there have been cases where you break the zoning law and you build more than you're allowed to. There are precedents, especially in New York City, about 25 or 30 years ago, where they did have to take off 17 stories of a building, but that's a story for a different day. So this all leads to, I think, what we call today in society, this whole bending the rules for people in certain circumstances. It's a little bit related to the discussion about amnesty, I think, because it's always in the news, whether it's tax amnesty or with immigration or with student loans, right? So it's a very hot topic. I don't really want to talk about it too much because we have one other topic to discuss, but you should know, and that's what we said before, is that for whatever reason, the Chachamim had this really, really soft, they were very, very flexible by this case. But again, we don't make this heckish and use it everywhere. Today, we love this concept of making things easier, right? You could pay your taxes now. If you're in default and if you're honest and you admit what you owe, we're not going to, zonk you for 20 years of interest and penalties, and then immigration. If you declare yourself, then you won't get into trouble. So student loans, we're not going to talk about. But again, it's the same thing. But obviously, the detractors of this concept of amnesty, you're always going to see that they always cite 3 different reasons why it's no good. A, because you basically encourage illegal activity. You're basically saying you could do this and there are ways to get around it. But what you're basically doing is you're encouraging people to do something that's illegal. The second problem is obviously it's unfair to those who do it legally, which is obviously the whole, student loan debate about all the people who did spend 15 years paying back their loans. And now, the new people don't have to pay anything back. Okay. And the third reason, I think, is because it basically undermines the rule of law, right? If you say you could do everything, and then we'll have, some time in a year from now where you could do tshuva, right? And be honest, and we'll let you, we'll be lenient on you, and we'll just slap you on the wrist. That kind of undermines, I think, at least the, the rule of law. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And in the last 15 minutes, I thought there's an incredible tie-in about this concept of bending the rules, right? Let's talk about the first story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Just as a quick summary, so Bar Kamsa feels slighted. He gets embarrassed, right? Because he gets invited to the party. He thought he was invited. Meanwhile, it was Kamsa, right? This is on Daf Nun Hey, right? The famous Kamsa Bar Kamsa that we almost do during the 9 days, but we miss it by a week. So the Gemara says that he felt slighted, and then the owner, and then the person who made the party ended up kicking him out, right? We know what happened. He said, I'll pay for it. Please don't embarrass me. No one really stood up for him. Okay. I want to focus on at the end of the story, because what's interesting is that the Gemara starts off this whole story by saying Rav Yochanan says What does the pasuk mean of Ashrei ha'adam mefachet tamid? And then all the way at the end, after Bar Kamsa is thrown out, he wants his revenge. So he tells the king that the Jews are rebelling, and I'm going to prove it to you. Send a korban. Just doing this recap. Send a korban and see if they take it. They don't end up taking it because he puts a mum in it. And the Chachamim there are debating, well, what do? We're going to have a potential catastrophe if we don't take this korban. So in comes a person by the name of Zechariah ben Avkulus, and he says, there is no way I'd ever let you make a korban, have a korban with a mum, because everyone's going to say, that's it, you could bring a korban with a mum. Okay, then he says, well, then let's kill Bar Kamsa, because if we kill Bar Kamsa, then we could end the story right now, and he'll never, ever be malshin on the king, right? And then he won't be malshin on us. And then he says, well, if you end up killing Bar Kamsa, they're basically going to say that if you have an animal, right, they're going to say that you're chayiv misa, right, for being matil lamum b'kodshim, for inflicting a mum, right, in a korban. So in the end, the Gemara says on the first wide line of 56a, Amalahu Rav Zechariah ben Avkulus Yomer Bali Mumin Kravim Lagabi Mizbeach. So Savr Lamikdale the Lalezel Velema Amalahu Rav Zechariah Yomer Matal Mum Kachim Yahareg. So basically, Zechariah ben Avkulus said, no, you can't do it. Forget about it. You have to let it ride. And because they let it ride and they let the story play out, Rav Yochanan again, the same Rav Yochanan, right? There's a lot to say on Rav Yochanan. I don't think we'll get to all of it, but keep in mind that this is Rav Yochanan saying, "An v'nusnashu of Zechariah ben Avkulus ichriv es beitenu v'sarfa es heichalenu v'higlinu me'artzenu." Wow! Because of the modesty, it's a very interesting word. An v'nusnu, humility. Rashi says savlanutu, savlanut. Most people don't know what that means in Israel. It means patience, right? It's the Hebrew word for patience. He was so patient and so full of humility, right, that he didn't kill Bar Kamsa when he could have. That single-handedly caused the Beis HaMikdash to be destroyed. So in the beginning, Rav Yochanan says it was destroyed because of Bar Kamsa. At the end, very important, at the end, Rav Yochanan says, no, it was because of Zechariah ben Avkulus that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So the question is, which one was it? Before we attempt to answer the question, there is the Zechariah ben Avkulus is mentioned one other time in Shas, and it's not really in Shas that he's mentioned. He's mentioned in Maseches Shabbos in the Tosefta all the way at the end. There's a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai regarding bones on Shabbos if you're eating. And you have chicken bones left over, and they become muktzah, so how do you deal with it? So Beis Hillel says, what you do is, you just lift the bones from the table and you throw it out. Not a big deal. Beis Shammai says, Misalik es atavla kula, what you do is umena'ara, right? There are some people, how do you clean up from a Shabbos table, right, Serena? What do? Right? You take the tablecloth and you bring it outside and you shake it out, right? You go very far down the block and you shake it out. Right? That's what Beis Shammai says. You know why Beis Shammai says that? Because you can't really touch the bones because they're muktzah. So the way to throw out the garbage is to take out the whole tablecloth and dump it all the way down the block. Says the Tosefta, Zechariah ben Avkulus lo hayanog lo kedivrei Beis Shammai lo kedivrei Beis Hillel. Zechariah ben Avkulus didn't hold like any of those two. You know what he did? He wanted to play it safe. He said, when you're eating the chicken, so you have the bone in your mouth, you spit it out under the bed. That way you don't even come to look at it to touch it, right? He didn't want to paskin like Beis Hillel. He didn't want to paskin like Beis Shammai, right? He didn't know what to do. Rabbi Yossi says the Tosefta, and v'nusnu shel Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus sarfa es ha'heichal. So there's really about an hour's worth to talk about the connection between this Gemara and Gittin and this. I'm going to give you just a few minutes worth. You see that in another instance, Rav Zechariah ben Avkilos, when it came to a trivial matter, couldn't really decide, do I hold like Beis Hillel or do I hold like Beis Shammai? So what do you do when you don't know? So to circumvent the whole thing, you do your own thing. You remove yourself by not even having to deal with a muktzah. Now, Beis Shammai was very machmir. He says you can't touch the bones, so you have to unload the tablecloth and not to touch the bones. The tablecloth isn't muktzah. He says, that's even too much for me. I don't know what to do. So because I don't know what to do, I'm going to avoid the situation. Does that ring a bell? It should ring a bell because that is exactly what he did in our case. In our case over here, he said, I can't let him make a mum, right? I can't kill him either. Now, did he stop to think what the ramification of his decision would be? No. If he would have stopped and thought what the ramification would have been, he may have come to a different conclusion. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan finds him at fault. And I want to read the words. There's much to say on this. Like I said, I want to just focus on the last 8 minutes of the Maratz Chayes. The Maratz Chayes says, it's he wants to know, he says, V'hainu mizeh dechazinan, Delo hayanachon ve'enin chazal darko sherav Zechariah ben Avkulus. They didn't like what he did. Sha'amar yomru bale mumin craven lagabe mizbeach muchach. So what do we see from here? We see that in fact he was wrong because the rule is muchach shemin hadin hayumutar mibnei emas hamalchus. When it comes to emas hamalchus, you could be over anything. You could kill somebody. You could put a mum in a carbon. If he just would have realized that you're allowed to break the laws. You're allowed to bend the rules sometime when you have a situation. You don't just see exactly what the text is, and that's what the Supreme Court does. You don't just look at the words. You have to define it. You have to put it into context, and you actually have to think about it. And that's what the job of rabbis are. You have to look at the whole situation and come up with a conclusion. You can't just read 2 sentences in the Shulchan Aruch and say, well, that's what we're doing. That's what his fault was. Says the Maratz Chayes, you know what Bar Kamsa was? Bar Kamsa was a rodef. Why? Because he could have single-handedly destroyed Klal Yisrael, and you know what he did? That's what the Maratz Chayes says. You have to be proactive. Because of his humility, Shal Rav Zechariah ben Avkulos lo hirhev benafsho owes. He didn't have the gumption. La'asot bazeh halacha lemaisa. He was too scared. B'chashash, he was worried. Sheyachduhu oto sha'asa shelo kahalacha. They're going to say, "Oh, look, he's got a mark against him because he didn't get the halacha right." V'lo hichshiv atzmo legadol. He was too modest, right? How often do you hear that? Never. Have you ever accused someone of being too much of an anav? Have you ever heard of someone being criticized as being too modest? Never. Here's the only time. The Gemara faults him for his modesty because there are times when you have to stand up and be the gadol that you are. The Gra says something very similar to that. We don't have time to talk about it, but the Gra has another play on that also. He says he should have used his knowledge to know that he had to put a stop to this. Lasot b'zeh halacha l'maisa v'chashish sheyachshedu so sheyasu shtolak yelchadav l'hivziyat l'gadol l'kvor b'daitu l'hiyos osa halacha l'maisa v'litos harasha v'chishev hiadavar nimtza rak l'gdol hador. The Maratz Chayes says that he thought I'm a nothing, right? Like people are trained to say, what do I know? I'm a nothing. Ich bin a gunish. No, we're all something, and you have to know when to channel that feeling of dominance and not just rely and say, oh, I don't know anything. That's why the Gemara says the modesty. He didn't want to come to any conclusion, just like he couldn't decide whether to hold like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai regarding chicken bones. And this is exactly to the point why the catastrophe of the Churban Habayis happened. It's interesting. This is that we mentioned that Rav Yochanan is the one who says this is the reason, because he didn't think of himself as a big person. The Gemara in Tainas Daf Chavtes says that Rav Yochanan says that the Meraglim also was a precursor to this. What was the chait of the Meraglim? The Maharal says that the chait of the Meraglim says V'chen hayinu be'einenu. Remember what it said in Parsha Shlach? They saw the grasshoppers, and the Torah says something trivial and like, okay, yeah, we saw grasshoppers. They thought we were giants, right? But what does that mean? They thought very lowly of themselves. They didn't think that they could go into Eretz Yisrael and conquer it. That's why they were what? That's why they kept on talking about chagavim. You know what a chagav is in Aramaic? A kamtza. Beautiful. This is the same Rav Yochanan Maseches Tainis. It's the same Rav Yochanan in Gittin Daf Nun Vav, and for the cherry on top, the Gemara in Bava Metzia at the end of Eil Metzia, Daf Lamed Amud Beis, I believe, says that what? You know why Yerushalayim was destroyed? Yerushalayim was destroyed because it says that they didn't keep the din to right. Let me just get the exact words. Hold on a second.
Shura Sadin.
Shura Sadin. You know what that means? That they were sticklers. They didn't have any flexibility. They looked at the law and they said, "This is it. This is the law, and that's it. There's no meandering. There's no straying. This is exactly it." If you were to just be a little bit, open and discuss it and see if there's some flexibility, like the takana shavim, like to make life easier and to think about it, right? Zechariah ben Avkulus and the Chagavim and all of these things, they all have in common stepping up to the plate. And it's beautiful because if you look at it, it's Rav Yochanan saying it in every single situation. In Tainis Daf Chavtes, in Bava Metzia Daf Lamed, and in Gittin Daf Nun Vav, it's all Rav Yochanan saying that, and that's the common thread between all three of them. I think that's a awesome way to end this. And that's it.